Hello and welcome to Politics and the Past with Robert Ferguson, presented by the Center for American Institutions. Joining me today, all the way from very chilly Tallahassee, Florida, is a former faculty associate of the. Were you a faculty associate with the center, or were you more associated just with the journal here,
Well,
Dr. Strickland?
both. I was associated with the center as well.
Okay, so a former faculty associate here for the Center for American Institutions and the Journal for Policy History, Dr. James Strickland, who has since left us and is now the director for the School of Civics at Florida State University. What's the full name here? I want to make sure I get it right.
I'm not the director, but I do direct the Constitutional Liberties branch at the Institute on Governance and Civics here at Florida State
Okay.
University.
As I was pulling that up, I realized there were both of those names, and I got a little bit nervous that I was gonna really screw that up. So I'm glad you were able to jump in there.
Oh, of course, I can't take credit for being the director.
Okay, okay. Dr. Strickland, a lot of your research revolves around the role of lobbying at the state level. And and a lot of that being historical research, not just contemporary research. I think a lot of people are familiar with how lobbying works in Washington. Obviously, there's lots of criticism of how lobbying works in Washington. The idea that some of the most expensive zip codes in the country are around Washington D.C., and a lot of that's reflected by lobbyist behavior, by lobbyists and their access to government. And I was wondering, Dr. Strickland, if maybe you could touch a little bit on how lobbying is distinct at the state level versus what it looks like at the federal level, or if it's distinctive at all.
Well, it's interesting you note that a lot of people understand how lobbying in Washington, D.C. works. Um, One thing that I teach my students in a course on interest groups is that there are a lot of misconceptions about lobbying, whether at the state level or at the national level. One misconception is that um, lobbying is about buying votes, but in reality, a lot of lobbying is about sharing information and building professional relationships. And certainly, by the time a proposal gets to the floor of a legislature for a vote, a lot of the details have been hammered out. And so we don't really see much of a correlation between campaign donations and votes on the floor when factors like party are significantly more powerful predictors. So a lot of lobbying occurs with friendly lawmakers. That is, lobbyists and lawmakers who tend to agree already tend to meet with each other and talk more often. Um, Campaign donations are often not about buying votes, but maybe about strengthening a relationship or helping an ally in office to stay in office. And a lot of lobbying is also about helping lawmakers to be more effective. So lobbyists may produce legislation, for example, or um, help lawmakers to determine what other lawmakers should be targeted for lobby efforts. And at the state level, a lot of those regularities are uh, still in existence. It's just you see other factors at play at the state level. You have multi state lobbying, for example. You don't really see that at the national level because there's only one Congress, of course.
Right. Okay. But do you find that kind of old-fashioned Mr. Smith goes to Washington vote buying lobbyist behavior would you find that to be more common at the state level than at the federal level, or is it still largely absent at the state level too?
So, lobbying at the state level has largely become more professional over time based on a lot of interview evidence and based on other types of data reporting, for example. Laws have become stricter at the state level. So it's no longer the case that you can purchase a lot of things for a legislator in most states without any disclosure or penalty, even. So a number of states in the 1990s adopted no cup of coffee rules, for example. You can't even buy a cup of coffee. Now, of course, enforcement is a different issue, but by and large, I don't have the impression that lobbyists are buying votes here and there at the state level or the national level. Um, was it that way at one point? Perhaps so. There's a lot of evidence that lobbyists used to give gifts freely. For example, in South Carolina, the state where I grew up, lobbyists used to give their credit cards to legislators when they arrived in town for the session. And the card would pay for meals and lodging and whatever. So that sort of thing is clearly illegal today.
Um, so, okay. So, one of the things that characterizes so many, kind of a distinction between state legislators and national legislators is that for state legislators, it's a part-time job in a lot of cases. So that might mean a couple of things. First of all, there might be more of an opportunity for capture, but even though the laws that you've mentioned have basically eliminated that. But it also means that maybe state legislators don't have the time to get to know an issue the same way that a national legislator does. So does that kind of maybe potentially reshape relationships between lobbyists and legislators?
Certainly, and in fact, I think there's another mechanism you did not mention, which is staff. A lot of state legislatures are poorly staffed. So, for example, the Wyoming legislature, I think, may have 30 to 50 full time staffers. You can contrast that with Congress, which has more than 10,000 staffers. The reason why staff matters is that often these individuals help lawmakers to produce legislation. And without staff, theoretically, lobbyists are the ones who produce legislation. You had mentioned session length. Sure, maybe that would play a role, but staff is primarily the big difference that political scientists talk about in terms of how state lobbyists can play an influence. Another way is term limits. There's no term limit in Congress, and a lot of states have term limits, and a lot of states, frankly, pay legislators poorly. So you have de facto term limits. A lot of people voluntarily step out of office. And when you have a lot of lawmakers who have served in office for fewer years, many have argued that that favors lobbyists, that they can exercise more influence by educating lawmakers more. And those lawmakers need the information due to their lack of experience.
Although I guess it probably hinders the ability of those long-term relationships to be built.
That's exactly right. So there's a balance between an expertise driven story and a relationships based story. And so there's some evidence, particularly from my own research, that shows there's less multi client lobbying in states with term limits um, because we say it can be difficult for lobbyists to form relationships and gain additional clients when their allies in office are moving out of office frequently.
Okay. So can you go into a little bit what you're talking about, like multi-client lobbying versus maybe single-client lobbying? What does that look like?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So many lobbyists represent many different clients. Um, for example, I could give you a few people who have 50 to 60 different clients during a single legislative session. These lobbyists are often known as contractors. They may be paid on an hourly basis to represent one client, and uh, they often represent clients with a variety of different issues. And those lobbyists are different from single client lobbyists who may or may not be an in-house employee for the one client. So when I say single client, I mean they are working for one organization only.
Right. Oh, okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. So, I could imagine if I'm a company or I'm a small interest group, something like that, where, not every session is there something that's going to come up that actually affects me, right? But there might be one really important session coming up where there's a key piece or a couple of key pieces of legislation that I have very, very strong opinions on and preferences on. And so you'd hire somebody who already knows all of the people at the state capitol is my assumption what would happen. But you don't want to hire them full time because it's not a full time job for them.
That's exactly right. So the contractor provides flexibility. You can hire them, you can pay them less as needed, keep them on retainer without having an in house employee.
Okay. So you mentioned the difference between states that have term limits and states that don't have term limits, even if those states that don't have term limits may have de facto time limits because every time, when I go to the Capitol to spend 6 months as a legislator, being paid my pittance and with maybe a little bit of per diem, that's time I'm taking away from my insurance agency or my law practice or my chiropractic practice or whatever that is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you see a difference in the way that legislators are approached, or the way that maybe relationships are nurtured?
I mean, that's a great question. I'll be honest with you, Robert. One of the big blind spots in political science literature is how do lobbyists first build relationships with lawmakers? We have different theories. One theory is that a lot of it is campaign finance related. So you provide donations in order to signal that you are a friendly cause, that the lawmaker should listen to you, that you want them to succeed. But that's one narrative. Another narrative is that you can lobby lawmakers in a social environment and perhaps become friends with them. But in terms of whether how building a relationship differs between state and national, we don't have very good insight into how the first step is taken to build a relationship. What we do know is that some lawmakers are initially distrustful of lobbyists; they don't want to talk. Um, and that might be a reason why you hire a staffer, a former staffer, or a former legislator, because then maybe there'll be some shared connection, some reason for that legislator to want to talk with them, that person that is.
Interesting. Okay, that actually builds nicely into my next question, which was who makes an ideal lobbyist?
Well, it depends on who you ask, of course. So a lot of the literature, the scholarship that is, would suggest that former legislators and staffers are great lobbyists, but I've heard actual lobbyists tell me that, particularly in Arizona, former legislators make the worst lobbyists because often they have enemies in the legislature or they serve such a short period of time that they don't have the information needed um, to really help out a whole lot. Um, but in terms of the evidence, I'll tell you what we do have. What we found is, and when I say we, I mean political scientists, we found that if you hire a very effective member of Congress, that is someone who formerly got pieces of legislation through the process, they tend to make a difference in terms of getting legislation through a committee if you hire them to lobby. So not all members of Congress are the same. Some are more effective than others. And if you hire a more effective member of Congress to lobby, our evidence suggests they will be a more effective lobbyist.
Interesting. And I expect that same. I mean, the logic, of course, applies at the state level too. Uh,
There have been no
or
tests
does
at
it
the
not?
state level. Well, I mean, the logic could apply certainly, but we don't yet know. So we need to conduct that research, don't we? It might depend because at the state level, as you mentioned earlier, some of these sessions are so short that maybe legislators don't get to know each other very well or they don't develop the expertise. There are term limits at the state level. It could be that legislators like those lobbyists in Arizona I mentioned, former state legislators are just less effective because of the lack of time spent in office. So yeah, it really depends.
Okay. I mean, it's probably a good point to kind of jump back a little bit here. And I mean, I've sort of made an assumption that our listeners understand what a short legislative session actually means, but maybe they don't. Dr. Strickland, can you maybe walk through like how, like what a state legislative calendar could look like from a really short perspective, maybe on the one from one degree to the other side of the spectrum?
So it's not uncommon for some state legislatures to meet for only 30 days, maybe 60 days. Um, that may or may not include calendar days. Some of your longer sessions, of course, are found in large states like California or New York, but it's really smaller states that have your shorter sessions. So think Wyoming, um, think of the Dakotas. Here in Florida, for example, we're limited to 60 days and it alternates every year. So the session will begin in January every other year and then in March every other year. And honestly, Robert, a few states still have sessions every 2 years as well. Um, and some states still have a budget session every 2 years, so they'll have a 2 year budget. And so things can be really short, but moreover, you can have some sessions where the budget is not debated, and so there are a lot fewer interest groups around the Capitol. Maine is a state that has a 2 year budget cycle like that,
Very interesting.
despite having sessions every year, to my knowledge.
That's interesting. I mean, I'm just trying to think of what you're discussing in a session when it doesn't involve the budget. I mean, a few things leap to mind, but it hardly seems.
It,
Um,
I would have to look at what the legislature actually does. And part of this actually is a historical legacy. So most state legislatures used to meet every 2 years. Some met every 4 years. For example, Alabama's legislature convened every 4 years. And so to this day, you still see a lot of sessions. They create a budget in odd numbered years. Those were the years in which legislatures would actually convene.
hmm, interesting. I mean, it's one of the things socially that you'll see if you ever drive through a small state capital, and you're there when the legislature isn't sitting, it's a ghost town.
That
And
would
then you come back when it's sitting and it's like buzzing in this hive of activity, but it might only be the buzzing hive of activity for 4 months every 2 years.
That's true. Here in Tallahassee, for example, the session uh, usually, well, to begin every other year in January, it may go until March or April. And so it can be hard to find a hotel room or a restaurant reservation at that time in downtown Tallahassee. But otherwise, it's going to be easier.
So don't travel to don't honeymoon to Tallahassee in like, January to, keep appraised of the legislative calendar if you're going to honeymoon in Tallahassee, I guess.
If you have a desire to honeymoon in a state capital, then sure, that might be good advice to follow. I personally don't know anyone who honeymoons in state capital, but maybe some people are out there.
Well, you want Florida, but you want to be like a little bit inland, maybe. I don't know.
Sure.
Might might be lots of reasons for it. Um, pardon me, sorry. Um, are there any specific, you mentioned the budget, but what are the sort of specific pieces of legislation that almost always invite lots of lobbying activity?
So the budget is certainly one. There's also tax legislation. So in Washington, D.C., for example, back in, I think, 1986, there was a really big increase in lobby activity because there was a major tax reform enacted in that year. We saw the same thing in 2017 as well when Trump's tax bill went through. So budgets and taxes are a huge deal. In terms of other bills that really make a difference, it really depends on the issue. Um, so budgets and taxes tend to affect a lot of different people, and so you find a lot of different interest groups lobbying on those issues. But not everyone may be affected by a bill on some sort of social issue, for example, um, or you name it. So really, those are the big ones.
Okay. Are there any really interesting cases in your own research that you've come across that, I mean, I'm just thinking the article I guess one of the leaps to mind is the article you wrote on tobacco lobbying and hospitals. I mean, you talk about that, but is there anything else that, like, of interesting case studies that that you can talk?
Well, I'd love to tell you more about that tobacco article. Essentially, we wanted to know why lobbyists, why interest groups would hire lobbyists who seemingly represented the other side. So it happens every year. Hundreds of lobbyists represent both tobacco and healthcare clients. And that seems counterintuitive. So if you're a hospital, why would you hire a tobacco lobbyist? Is there a chance that they will lobby against you? Um, will they have your best interests at heart? And so what we did in this paper is we wanted to know, okay, is there a certain type of healthcare interest group that will avoid a tobacco lobbyist? And we find that a lot of membership-based groups avoid tobacco lobbyists because they may not want to annoy the members. Whereas a hospital or an insurance company, they provide a service regardless. They don't have to attract members acting voluntarily. So they have more leeway for annoying a few people here and there. Um, some
So by membership organization, you might mean like the American Medical Association or something like that.
It could be, yes, although that is a professional association. We could think of an entirely voluntary, non-professional association, such as I'll give you an obvious one: the American Lung Association. We would hope that they would not hire tobacco lobbyists or the American Cancer Society. But some of them do. We do have some cases in our data where anti-cancer groups have hired tobacco lobbyists. Um, Whereas hospitals and insurance companies, um, they don't, to be honest, they hire tobacco lobbyists as often as anybody. And when I say tobacco lobbyists, I mean a lobbyist who represents at least one tobacco company.
Okay, so not maybe not somebody who happens to be lobbying on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce in some tobacco, like an area that grows a lot of tobacco.
No, no, these are lobbyists who explicitly registered to represent a tobacco company or some sort of pro tobacco interest group.
Okay, so does that seem to be just sort of coincidence in the sense that like hospitals, they just don't care what somebody, who somebody is represented in the past, or who else they might be representing, or are they actually targeting tobacco lobbyists?
So there's a lot of evidence that tobacco lobbyists primarily are multi-client lobbyists. They are among the best paid lobbyists in state capitals. Um, and these are access driven lobbyists. They may be hired by clients, various clients who have unpopular causes or maybe causes that the public does not fully understand. And so if these individuals are known for having professional relationships with lawmakers, then that may be a reason for hospitals to target these lobbyists in particular and hire them.
Interesting.
So,
You, I also I also imagine to some degree, if you're a highly paid tobacco lobbyist, you might have room to say, you know what, I might work for the hospital a little cheaper because it might give me some professional camouflage to some degree as well, or something else that I can highlight on my CV and not quite attract the same degree of negative attention.
so in a number of interviews, my research is not interview based, but in a number of interviews I've seen a lot of lobbyists will discuss the variety of clients that they represent. And they seem to suggest the lobbyists that they represent a variety of clients because they have a lot of expertise in different issue areas, or at least a lot of connections as well. And so going back to your question, does a tobacco lobbyist strategically want to represent a hospital? I don't know. I don't have any evidence of that, but maybe.
Okay. Yeah. Um, I guess, I mean, when I think of tobacco lobbyist, I think of the main character in Thank You for Smoking. That's my, that's what I have in my mind. Um, but anyway, that's really interesting. So but you did mention that you might think there's some concern that the lobbyists would be arguing on two sides of the same issue. Is that not a concern for hospitals, or have they got a different perspective?
Well, it might very well be a concern. One thing that I found is in this paper you mentioned is that there are 7 states that explicitly prohibit lobbyists from representing clients with different interests, provided that unless the lobbyist gets permission from the clients. So there has to be some sort of written statement from the clients that, yes, you may continue to represent us. We've been made aware of a potential conflict of interest. And in those 7 states, healthcare lobbyists just discernibly hire tobacco lobbyists less often, just across the board, less often. Doesn't matter what type of healthcare interest group you are, you're going to hire tobacco lobbyists less often. So why is that? Well, it could be that, all of the hospitals in other states don't know they've hired tobacco lobbyists until it was disclosed to them. In these 7 states, I don't know. Um, what was your question again, Robert?
Yeah, no problem. No. Yeah, I, I, uh, I think I was asking, like, are they, um, are they just hiring, or is it that they're unaware of the conflict of interest, I guess, or is there some actual mutual interest between tobacco companies and hospitals that we're not thinking of?
Oh yeah, I love that. I love that idea, but I don't have evidence of it. So whenever I tell my undergraduate students about this, 1 or 2 of them typically suggest, well, hospitals may not want people to be healthy. Why not continue to smoke? I don't have any evidence of such a sinister motivation. Um, what I could suggest is that I'm not sure if hiring a tobacco lobbyist is the best way for a hospital to ensure continued business. I mean, there are other ways that they can ensure continued business. At the end of the day, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier. A lot of lobbying is about maintaining relationships and sharing information. It's not about buying votes. By the time a bill reaches the floor of the Senate or the House, a lot of the details have been hammered out. And at that point, party may be a much more powerful predictor.
Sure, and I guess, and I wasn't actually necessarily thinking of the sinister motive. I was actually kind of thinking, in my mind, I was trying to imagine, is there even some procedural or some sort of committee work, that kind of thing, that just they seem to line up on in some sort of fashion, but or if maybe it just happens that hospitals are well represented by one party and tobacco interests also happen to be well represented by that party. So there's just sort of they're in the same network,
Well, yeah, those
But
those are all legitimate questions. So going back to the lobbyist who represents 50 to 60 clients per session, he may not be talking about the same issue on behalf of the same clients, right? So there's no evidence in that paper um, that you've mentioned. There's no evidence that lobbyists actually represent different clients with different interests. So if we assume that a lobbyist can be perfectly ethical as long as they communicate to lawmakers what the clients want them to hear, then yeah, it's totally possible for an ethical lobbyist to represent both a tobacco and a healthcare client. But we have to assume that the 2 messages are totally separate. And you could have conflicts elsewhere. I mean, a lobbyist might represent both dentists and candy distributors or something. You can think of these conflicts all day long.
sure, but hospital and tobacco interests are much better way of framing that, right?
Oh, of
But
course. And that's why we studied them in the paper instead of, dentists and candy distributors or beer
Yeah.
beer lobbyists in hospitals. But it's an open question about what about marijuana, recreational marijuana in healthcare as well. So um, we just went with the traditional boogeyman of tobacco in this paper.
Yeah, I mean, again, the first thing that I saw when I looked at it was my initial thought was like the old Baptist and bootleggers approach to prohibition, right? But then you sort of think which was that both Baptists and bootleggers benefited from prohibition, so they wanted to vote for it, right? Um, but that there, the way that you've described it so in this conversation so far is that this is such a lobbying really is such a complicated difficult, usually sophisticated exercise, so that there's so many moving parts to it that the public is never going to see that they're just almost by coincidence, if nothing else, there's going to be mutual interest even from um, apparently on or superficially conflicting parties.
That's true. However, despite all of the moving parts, some trends continue to stick out. So, in those states with anti conflict of interest laws, we do find a legitimate decrease in conflicted lobbyists. Um, yeah, part of my research is trying to make order out of all of this chaos and out of all of the moving parts that you've mentioned.
Hmm. Okay, so I've got to, going to pivot to something a little bit different here. There are some states in the United States that are dominated by a single party. At the state, at there's a supermajority in the legislature, in the House and the Senate, the governor's office. Basically, they've been single party for 30, 40, 50 years, something like that. How is lobbying maybe different there than it is in a place where there's contesting parties, where relationships really matter because or relationships might be really important, but your relationship is with a party that's not anywhere near power for the next 4 8 years.
So, a few things. Lobby firms now, there's evidence that lobby firms are forming ties with lawmakers of particular parties. So, some lobby firms, that is, think of these lobby firms as businesses where contractor lobbyists attract clients to represent. They're like law firms very often, or they may be part of a law firm. Um, Many of the lobbyists in particular firms may represent clients who are more aligned with Republicans or Democrats. And so the lobby firm becomes associated in terms of reputation with Republicans or Democrats. So you may have lobby firms that win or lose whenever a particular party takes control of a legislature. Suddenly, that lobby firm, if they're known for having connections to the Republicans or to the Democrats, then whoever is in the majority, as long as they have connections to the majority, that will help them. Now, we also have some evidence that more interest groups appear to lobby in states that are not controlled by a single party. So, in a state like Illinois, a solidly Democratic state, on average, Illinois has fewer interest groups than what we would expect if the legislature was competitive. So, in a legislature that is competitive, such as Arizona, maybe Minnesota, we see more interest groups per person, so adjusting for state population, than we do in a state like Illinois or a state like Florida or a state like New York, where one party has control. And part of that is you don't know exactly which party will control a majority in the future. And so it may be in your best interest to retain lobbyists or to maintain a presence in the legislature.
Interesting. I also wonder if in a one party state, and again, they're not one party states, but generally controlled by one party,
Some
where
states are
the
nearly
leaders
one party.
so Jack Hinrichs, who jumps on with me pretty regularly. I like his deep dives on South Dakota, which we've kind of which we have christened the country's most Republican state, like going back a long way. The Democrats haven't really held power at any level there for a very, very, very long time. But I wonder, just because it's a one party state doesn't mean that the parties are monolithic, of course. And so I wonder how much of this lobbying is done within the partisan process, then, rather than necessarily in the halls of the state legislature.
Certainly, there is a very popular view among political scientists that political parties are essentially large coalitions of interest groups. And I think there's a lot of evidence for that view. And so it could very well be the case that some interest groups don't lobby as intensely if they already get what they want from a one party legislature. Um, so to sort of give you a new way of looking at things, there's no need to buy someone's vote if they're already going to vote the way you want them to, right? Like the cost of the vote is zero. And so it could simply be the case that in those states that are one party, a lot of the interest group activity occurs during party primaries to ensure that the right candidates are nominated by the party. But that begins to walk a little bit beyond my personal expertise. But certainly, I do think there's a lot of evidence that political parties are large coalitions of interest groups.
So, what in your mind, what really, um, when does an interest group become significant enough typically to start hiring lobbyists?
Well, that's a great question, Robert. When you say significant, do you mean in terms of member size or spending or something else?
Actually, I'm gonna change the question. So I'm going
Okay.
to remove the word significant because I don't like the word significant. Actually, what I'm going to say is, when does an interest group decide to hire a lobbyist versus interest groups that might exist for a very long period of time and never hire?
Well, that's a great question. So, a lot of business firms tend to hire lobbyists when the legislature considers an issue that affects them for the first time. And then after that, the business may keep the lobbyists on retainer. So there's a lot of stickiness in these relationships. I'll give you an example. Microsoft is a textbook case of a large business that did not hire a lobbyist for a very long time. But then in the 1990s, the Department of Justice began to accuse Microsoft of acting as a monopoly, of violating antitrust law. And at that point, Microsoft really increased its lobby presence in Washington, D.C. And that gained a lot of attention in the popular press. So for 16 years, Microsoft did not hire any lobbyists, and then suddenly they hired a lot. And the reason why it is said is because the federal government began to chase them or to accuse them of being a monopoly. There are other examples like that, but the general idea with business interests is that they hire lobbyists when they need to. They would rather be doing something else. Now, with other types of interest groups like the Sierra Club or ACLU, these are not organizations that provide a private service or good. And often what they want is inherently political. It has to come from the government. Uh, in particular, environmental protections or civil rights or civil liberties, it has to involve the government in some way. And so typically these organizations will lobby on a persistent basis, and they'll have an in-house lobbyist frequently because it makes more economic sense to hire in-house than to have a contractor. And so in
Interesting.
terms of significance, there's not really a threshold I have to tell you. Um, we don't have, political scientists don't have a magic dollar number in terms of how much revenue it takes before you hire a lobbyist, but often businesses do hire lobbyists when government affects them in some way.
No, I like how you answered that question. Significant was, again, not the word I was looking for. I think what I was maybe reaching for was what distinguishes a at what point, and I think you've answered that question very, very well. Because, like, yeah, I mean, if you're a business and you're just getting started, you're trying to make money. You're just trying to find customers. You're not worried about politics
And
until you need to.
Sure, sure. Maybe your competitors lobby, for example. So some say that the federal government began to target Microsoft because competitors of Microsoft accused it of violating antitrust laws. So maybe they are lobbying. Um, well, maybe the government is doing something that you dislike. But also, Robert, another way of answering this question, a lot of potential groups never lobby at all. So it's very unusual to see lobbyists for the unemployed or lobbyists for the homeless or lobbyists for undocumented people. And so um, this goes back to a larger idea that it's much more difficult for some groups to form into an organization than others.
Sure. I mean, organization for something like this is or it just reflects how important organization is for achieving political goals.
And it's often
Um,
said if you're not at the table, then you are on the menu. So, in other words,
inter-
being present during a policy conversation can at least ensure you're heard and that your position in government is not disfavored um, or something bad doesn't happen to you somehow.
Interesting. Okay, so if you're a, you mentioned up until this point, that there for the most, or maybe this is maybe I'm mischaracterizing this, that m- are most lobbying firms at this point lining up behind either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, or are there still major firms that have relationships with both?
That's a great question. I was not the author of that study, and so I just don't have the data in front of me to give you a quantitative answer like that. You know, to answer your question, most I just don't know at this point. But I can tell you that as Congress has polarized over time, one of the major findings of the paper is that interest groups have polarized as well as lobby firms.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I guess I think of the interest groups that you'd be hard pressed to distinguish the National Rifle Association from the Republican Party, or the Sierra Club from the Democratic Party. I mean, those might be extreme issues, but uh, you,
Say that interest groups like that are causing polarization in Washington.
okay, maybe can go into that a little bit?
Sure, sure. So, if we assume that interest groups help legislators to produce legislation, if we assume that interest groups are often members of political parties or coalitions within parties, even if we assume that lobby firms have ties with particular members of a party, then why can't it be the case that an organization like an interest group, a single issue organization, and I'll say Sierra Club or NRA, I'll apply the term single issue, although they take positions on a number of issues, but generally a single policy domain, right? Why can't those organizations begin to call the shots more often when their allies are elected in Congress? Wouldn't those organizations be producing legislation or research that would be useful? And so some suggest that these interest groups are contributing to polarization by subsidizing the process. They're giving more information to their allies in Congress already, who are already there. Um,
And I mean, and that's probably exacerbated by the fact that that we've seen in Congress that leadership of each party has a lot more power. Individual congressmen are, maybe not powerless, but feel like they have less power and are more interested, and in a lot of cases, are spending a lot more time on communications than they are on policy work.
Certainly, certainly. And going back to what you said earlier, it's interesting. We have some evidence now that particularly powerful members of Congress, so the Speaker of the House or committee chairs, they don't meet with lobbyists as often as rank and file members do because there's such a demand for the time of the leaders. They cannot meet with all of these lobbyists. They're more choosy or selective, whereas rank and file members are much more willing. And so that would be some evidence that would contradict in part this polarization driven story. Um, but back to your idea, I mean, a leader in Congress, presumably, they can't do something if all of their members and their caucus opposes it. So,
Yeah, interesting. Very interesting. Okay, um, you have a paper. Maybe you want to wait until it comes out, but I did notice that you've got a paper coming out on lobbying and the Equal Rights Amendment.
oh yeah, yeah, that's already out. I'm happy to talk
Is it
about it.
already out? Okay, I
Oh
wasn't sure
yeah.
if it was already out or not. So okay, are you able to talk about that a little bit? That sounds really interesting.
Oh, I'm happy to. So you almost certainly know the Equal Rights Amendment, proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution, would have prohibited sex-based discrimination. And Congress proposed it in 1972 and sent it to the state legislatures. And so I wanted to know, all right, so once the amendment got to the state legislatures, who tried to stop it and who tried to get it passed? Ultimately, the Equal Rights Amendment failed, and there are different stories about who killed it. So, for example, some say that Phyllis Schlafly and the Eagle Forum and the New Right mobilized against the ERA and convinced state legislators not to support it. Others, particularly Gloria Steinem, the feminist, others say that insurance companies killed the Equal Rights Amendment because they did not want to have to pay, or excuse me, charge men and women the same rates. And so, what I do in this paper, I look at lobbying in the states on the Equal Rights Amendment to see which lobby efforts were most correlated with votes of state legislators. And ultimately, I don't find any evidence that insurance killed the ERA. What I find is that lobbyists active on the ERA and against the ERA explicitly, they had an effect on Republican votes for the ERA, but not on Democratic votes. But to sum it up, the difference was so small, the effect is so small that the ERA probably would have failed even if a lot of people lobbied for it or against it.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yes. So what is that? I mean, is that something that we can extrapolate to other issues, that conclusion, or is that something that probably just in the case of the ERA?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, when Congress proposes an amendment, it usually goes to state legislatures. So we've had 27 amendments, and all but one went through the state legislatures. So we have to ask, would there be lobby battles in the states for an amendment? So the ERA was a protracted battle. The states had 7 years initially to approve of it. Congress then extended the deadline. Um, but other constitutional amendments may not generate as much controversy. So, for example, the Congressional Pay Raise Amendment from the 90s, uh, there may not be a lot of lobbying on that, or there may not have been a lot of lobbying on it.
Right. Okay. No, that's makes a lot of sense. I'm also, one of the things that also, when you're explaining that to me that I hadn't considered is that the extensions on the ERA, the fact that it is a 7-year protracted process. On the one hand, you think, okay, well, that gives interest groups lots of time to kind of muddy the waters if they want to defeat an amendment. But at the same time, it also gives like advocates for the amendment, like it becomes a marathon. And there's an opportunity to wait out opposition too.
Sure.
Although the legislators at the state level are going to rotate, they're going to change, and so it might actually, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm just thinking of ways in which that, strategies on both sides there.
And, most amendments did not have the 7 year deadline. So the 7 year deadline, Congress started attaching it to proposed amendments in the progressive era. There's nothing magical about 7 years, to my knowledge. Um, why might we have any deadline? Well, I mean, I'll go back. There are some amendments still to this day that are technically pending. The child labor amendment, for example, could be ratified if it got enough states on it. There's no deadline to my knowledge. Or some other amendments from before the Civil War are pending as well. So why would we have a deadline? Well, it could be that there are different people in office in the state legislatures, and if we don't have a deadline, then ultimately any amendment might be ratified at some point. Um, but yeah, is it a protracted lobby battle? Yeah, it certainly is a protracted lobby battle. And a lot of people suggest that Phyllis Schlafly was successful in making the ERA controversial. So when Congress proposed the ERA in 1972, it was super popular among Republicans and Democrats. But that changed over time. It became a polarizing issue, and many people attribute Schlafly to making it a polarizing issue over time, of course.
Yeah, right. Anyway, very interesting. Well, Dr. Strickland, that's been a really interesting conversation. I get just one last question. How do you see, we live in a digital age, right? Everything's digital, and especially since COVID, there's less opportunities, I imagine, even in Washington for the social environment. How has, in your mind, or how have you seen that lobbying change in this digital age?
One of my favorite guest speakers I've had in my interest groups course has described um, the field of public relations as not being about lobbying, not even mostly about lobbying, but rather there are social media influencers who are being paid by companies. The Wall Street Journal had an article about this recently, for example. And so often a, um, a public affairs campaign may not be about targeting members of Congress for direct lobby efforts. It may be getting their constituents to think differently about an issue so that the member of Congress has to respond at some point ultimately. So I think this opens up a whole new world of possibilities and uh, in the field of influence generally, public affairs generally. Um, so lobbying is not your only option. And so if it wasn't for social media or digital platforms generally, I don't know if this type of influence for the masses would be possible.
Hmm. So do you see that as a competitor to lobbying then?
Well, personally, I would see it as a complement or complementary good. So we have some evidence already from 20 years ago that companies can time the advertisements in members' districts to correspond with committee votes and with inside lobbying. In other words, you can use an advertisement on TV on healthcare reform. You can time that to help your lobbyists get access to a member or to try and sway a member's vote on a committee. Timing is crucial. And so it could simply be that you want a member of Congress to start talking about an issue at the same time that you want to lobby them directly on the issue. And it would really help if the constituents start talking about the same issue, then the member of Congress knows something is going on as well. So maybe they'll want to spend more time with you as a lobbyist. So I see it more as a complementary thing, like another tool, but not necessarily as a competitor. Your competitors can use it, certainly.
Sure, yeah. No, that's really interesting. Have you seen it change, or from? I mean, I know your research is difficult. It's, one of the things about doing research, even in political science, is that you don't things that are currently happening are difficult to actually research. But did you see things changing with COVID as far as lobbying goes, or since COVID?
Well, sure. I mean, Robert, a few state legislative sessions were canceled entirely or they were abbreviated. Nevada, for example, completely got rid of its lobby law for an entire year, like no lobbyist registration at all, um, due to COVID. And so there have been changes. However, I haven't personally asked lobbyists how did COVID affect your job because I'll be honest, I've sort of assumed that well everything went online and you had a lot of Zoom meetings at that point. But I think that's really a research project waiting to be written. So
Well, along with a million other COVID research questions that we're going to have to wait a few more years before we can really engage in.
Yeah, yeah, there's a lot of COVID research. I'm always a little bit contrarian, Robert, so maybe that's why I haven't written that paper. Everyone's writing COVID papers.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Well, it's a good time for a prohibition paper or something like that, right?
Of course.
Yeah. All right. Well, Dr. Strickland, thank you very much. Appreciate you joining me. I've learned a lot and really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, it's been a pleasure, Robert. Thank you so much.
All right.